am back with another book review, and today we're going to be chatting about Sunrise on the Reaping. I'm keeping with the same format for this review, where I give you my overall impressions of the book, and then I'll jump into Goodreads to react to some of the reviews there. Before we jump into things, I want to mention that there will be spoilers in this review, above and beyond what we already know from the Hunger Games series. So if you want to read this book and you haven't already, I'd recommend leaving this video and coming back once you've had a chance to read it. I've read all 4 books in the Hunger Games series, so going into this book, I knew to expect YA, dystopian, speculative fiction, and of course it met my expectations in that area. This book is a prequel to the Hunger Games trilogy, but it's set after the events of The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which was released in 2020. If we're looking at the timeline here, the Hunger Games trilogy was set during the 74th Hunger Games. The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes was set during the 10th Hunger Games, and this book, Sunrise on the Reaping, was set during the 50th Hunger Games. Let me start with what I loved about the book. The first thing that I loved were the callbacks. I loved seeing the familiar names in this book, like Wyrus and Beatty and Mags. There were also a lot of callbacks in this book to The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I think the reading experience would be enhanced if you've read the previous Hunger Games books and also remember a lot about the books. The second thing I really loved about this book were some of the new characters. A few of the characters that really came to life for me were Maisily and Ampert. I also really enjoyed Wyatt's character. So there were a lot of characters in this book that were new that I also enjoyed, in addition to the callbacks or characters from previous books. The last thing that I'll mention that I loved was how the author interwove a famous poem into the book, and I'm talking about The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. There are snippets of this poem throughout the book, and at the end we actually get the entire poem reprinted, interspersed with Suzanne Collins's own writing. So I thought that was really neat, and I didn't really notice it at first. I knew there was this song that kept coming up, and there was a raven and nevermore, and of course that would be a huge clue, but I didn't actually clue in until very close to the end. I was like, wait a second, this is Edgar Allan Poe's famous poem, which I've actually never read in its entirety. Going through the book itself, I do try to read the songs, but I find them very hard to focus in on. I tend to skim over big blocks of text that are in italics, so I did find it a little bit distracting to have the song in so many different places in the book, but I tried really hard to read the passages. I think I still glazed over on some of them, but when it all came together in the end, I thought it was actually very beautifully done. Even though these passages were very hard for me to get through in the moment, now that I'm finished the book and I'm looking back, I really love that it added another layer to the book, another dimension. I felt quite emotional as I was reading the last chapter, and I think the poem had a lot to do with that. Overall, I did really love this book, but there were a couple of things that stood out to me that I was like, okay, this isn't quite a 5-star book for me for these reasons. The first was that it was very hard for me to get into the book. I think it's because I've watched the Hunger Games movies and I associate Haymitch with Woody Harrelson, and it was very hard for me to get past the current incarnation of this character. This kind of like curmudgeon-y, smart alecky, not super likable person. Even though you suspect that his heart is in the right place, he's not one of my favorite characters in the Hunger Games trilogy. So it took me a while to adapt to this new Haymitch character that we're presented with, who is quite different from the Haymitch character that we know from the Hunger Games trilogy. We also meet young Haymitch when he is already in love with Lenore Dove, and that was hard for me to reconcile because I see Haymitch as this Woody Harrelson character who is so crusty and hard to love, and of course there are reasons that he became that way, but just doing a full rewind and being thrown into the book like that, it was very difficult for me to suspend my disbelief and all of my preconceived notions about this character. So that might be a very personal thing, a personal blockage that I encountered when I started this book. The other thing I wanted more of in this book were a few more surprises. This book is a little bit different because we already know the ending. We know Haymitch survives. We know he's alone at the end. There were a lot of things in this book that we knew the outcome of already. So often in this book, I felt like we were just going through the motions and there wasn't really anything new that was introduced. Of course, the callbacks were great, as I mentioned, and I loved the new characters, but I would have liked a few more little surprises. So there's a section in this book where Maiseli alludes to knowing something about Lenore Dove that Haymitch doesn't know. She does this, I think, 2 times that I can recall. One of the times is that she has orange paint under her fingernails, and we find out at the end that she's been painting what's essentially graffiti in the seam, and these are messages that support the rebellion. But I didn't feel like that was a satisfying reveal because we already knew, and Haymitch had already suspected, that she was very anti-capital, so it didn't feel like there was any new information that was revealed, and I was a little bit disappointed about that. I would have liked to see maybe some more differences or some more surprises here and there because this book follows so closely the first Hunger Games book, and as well because we essentially know the ending already. Now for my star rating. As I was reading this, and for probably 95% of the book, I thought I was going to give it 4 stars, but I would say the last chapter plus the epilogue, there was something about them that made me feel so emotional. I wanted to immediately go back and read the Hunger Games trilogy as well as the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. So after finishing the book, and the ending really did it for me, I would give this book 4.5 stars. Rounded for Goodreads, I would still give it a 4, but I ended up loving this book, and I think maybe if I read the entire series again, I will have an even better appreciation for this world that Suzanne Collins has created. Now it is time to jump into Goodreads. The cover is really beautiful. I love the cover of this book. This book has a really high average review right now, 4.64. Taking a look at the distribution, of course, mostly 5-star reviews and very, very few 1-star reviews, which I think makes sense. People who know and love the Hunger Games trilogy are probably the ones who are drawn to this book. And yes, we've got dystopia, young adult, fantasy, science fiction. I could definitely see that. All right, let's jump into the reviews now. I am recording this video on April 22nd at around 10 a.m. and I suspect that the reviews are going to be very dynamic. There are going to be lots of new reviews coming up constantly because this is such a new book. Let's go ahead and apply the filters. We're gonna read newest reviews in English, and let's start with 5 stars. The first one is by Alara, 6 stars. Haymitch Abernathy, you will always have a special place in my heart. Even though it took me a while to get into this book, and I want to say that I thought Woody Harrelson made a great Haymitch, fantastic Haymitch. It was just so hard for me to separate young Haymitch from the Woody Harrelson version of Haymitch. I was very distracted for the first part of the book, but the end of the book packed an emotional punch. I was totally into it by the end, and Haymitch also has a very special place in my heart now as well. Here's a 5-star review from Pippa. I have never read a book that has made me full-on sob hysterical throughout. I am heartbroken, OMFG. I wasn't moved to tears until the last chapter, but I did feel very emotional when many of the characters died, because of course everyone who is reaped for the 50th Hunger Games dies except for Haymitch, so we know this is going to happen, but I still felt emotional throughout because I had felt a sense of connection towards a lot of the characters. Suzanne Collins writes young characters very well, and I think this is because she started as a children's book author. Case in point, Rue from the first Hunger Games book. Oh my goodness, I was so emotional when she died. That definitely made me tear up. There wasn't really a character that got to me in the same way that Rue did, but I still felt very emotional. And I should mention here again that I don't really cry when I read books. Tearing up for me is already something that is quite rare, so that means I am feeling a lot of emotions when that happens. Let's do one more 5-star review. What a book. Took me a while to get going, but once the characters reached the capital, it flew by. Read the majority of it in 3 days. Great writing, characters are all brilliant, and their progression throughout the book is great. Terribly sad ending. I agree with this review for the most part. Even though we meet a lot of characters, there are a lot of characters in this book, I felt like their arcs were done pretty well, even though they were quite short. Suzanne Collins packed a lot of events into this book, considering it's not even that long of a book, so I thought the pacing was really good. I will say that this wasn't as much of a page turner for me as the first Hunger Games book. I was content to read the book at like a steady pace. I wanted to know what would happen next, but I wasn't as invested in the story, as curious about the story as I was with the first Hunger Games book, and I think that makes sense because there is a lot of repetition in here. We know what a lot of these things are already. We know what a reaping is. We know the structure of the Hunger Games themselves. We know that President Snow is twisted and evil and he's going to bring harm to Haymitch's loved ones. So I found that those surprise elements really weren't there for me, and that's usually what keeps me wanting to read more. That's not to say I didn't like this book, it's just that I didn't feel that urge to read all the time like I do when I need to know what happens next. Now let's move on to the 4-star reviews. This one's from Chloe. To second Ben's review, I'd drink too if I were Haymitch, JFC. Yeah, you can definitely see why Haymitch turned out the way he did and why he needed substances to get him through the day. There was a lot of pain in his life, a lot of suffering, a lot of loss, and a lot of grief. I definitely am feeling this review as short as it is. Here's a 4-star review by Adri. Coriolanus Snow, the worst man to ever exist. Everything he did is so wretched, so evil, so distorted, so twisted, so hungry for power. He won at the end, the damage was done, but the games ended and how many died? How many lost their lives fighting for freedom just to continue to being tortured? Haymitch, his story is tragic. He tried so hard. He just wasn't luckier. I'm glad Katniss and Peeta came into his life. I'm glad that he has people to love. I'm glad that even with all that pain, he managed to live long enough to never see the sunrise on the reaping. Yeah, I'm feeling this review. I'm feeling a lot of these reviews. You can definitely tell that these are reviewers, readers, humans who love the Hunger Games series. I really see that in this review especially. Coriolanus Snow is indeed a very twisted individual who thrives on pain, and we learn in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes that he had a lot of pain growing up as well. And I forgot to mention in my overall impressions, which is why I love reacting to these reviews, because they bring up thoughts that I had maybe forgotten about. But this book was very interesting in terms of the political message. And of course, the political message is underlying in all of these books because the capital is in all of these books. But the quote that Suzanne Collins chose to include at the beginning of the book is reflective of the times. I'll just read a portion of it because it's a long quote by David Hume. Nothing appears more surprising to those who consider human affairs with a philosophical eye than the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers. I thought that was such an interesting quote to include right at the beginning of the book, and there are 4 quotes at the beginning. Quite a number of quotes. Usually you see 1 or 2, but there are 4, and this one in particular is quite long. It made me think a lot about the current political environment, and I just thought it was a really interesting quote to include. Let's read one more 4-star review. Oh my heart. I should not have been surprised that this book would not have a happy ending for poor Haymitch, but wow. Bravo to Suzanne Collins for sewing everything together beautifully and for sharing backstories of so many others, Effie, Mags, Beatty, and Wiress, Plutarch alongside Haymitch's. The horrors hold no punches. 4.5 stars. Well done, but I won't be returning anytime soon to the land of tears and trauma. I feel like this book was really written with fans of the Hunger Games series in mind because of all of the callbacks. I really loved when Effie made an appearance in this book. This part was a surprise for me. I knew Proserpina's sister would be someone. The way the author teased the sister, I was like, okay, this must be someone we know, but I couldn't really remember the Hunger Games books very well because I had read them so long ago. And when it ended up being Effie, I was thrilled. I have a soft spot for Effie because of her optimism and because of her hope. I feel like she is a good person, and so I do really like that character, and I was so happy to see a little bit of her backstory in this book. And it was also nice to see that this resistance, this group of people, this coalition working together, Mags, Beatty, Wirus, Plutarch, and now Haymitch. It went back to the 50th Hunger Games and even before that. Of course, it took another 24 years for the sun to no longer rise over a reaping, but I guess resistances, revolutions, rebellions, they take time. Let's now move on to the 3-star reviews. Here's a review from Esme. 3 pity stars. It's more of a 2.75, but I just can't believe I didn't like this book. It really didn't live up to my expectations. I had to Google this, but RTC stands for review to come, so I think Esme is going to write more, but right now it's just a 3-star review without a lot of commentary. So this person was expecting more from this book and unfortunately didn't get it. Here's a review from Jacob. 3.5 stars. This was really good. Hunger Games books have and will always knock me out of a reading slump, and this did just that. I really loved how much of the overall universe we got to see and all of the characters that we have seen before getting more time to shine. Anything Lucy Gray related broke my heart. I fear she is my favorite character in the entire series. While I did think that this book was good, I didn't enjoy it quite as much as The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I'm not sure, the pacing of this one was a little off, especially when we were in the arena itself. Suzanne Collins, I will say you did a phenomenal job on the message of this book, and I thought it was very clever and also felt very current. Definitely a heartbreaking story, would read again. I agree with this review overall, except that I think I like this book more than The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, although I did like that one as well. I did love Lucy Gray's character, and it was nice that we got a little callback here, and at the end we do get confirmation, because this was a cliffhanger in The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, that Lucy Gray at some point did pass away, and she was laid to rest in the same area that Lenore Dove was. I will definitely read this book again. I'm actually really excited to read it again. Let's read one more 3-star review. I liked it, though I must admit that the first-person POV was more of a challenge than usual, and I hated one of the characters. Hated, damn it. I'm trying to think if there were any characters that really rubbed me the wrong way, besides, of course, President Snow, but I can't think of anyone. I definitely feel no empathy or compassion for President Snow in general, but there was a tiny part of me that was like, wow, you must really be hurting. You must really be miserable to need to inflict that onto somebody else. And there was just this very full circle moment in terms of Snow's relationship with Lucy Gray, the way Lenore Dove died, that brought up a lot of emotion for me, a lot of thoughts, a lot of conflicting feelings. And I agree that the first person POV was a big challenge for me. As I've mentioned a few times in this video, it was very hard for me to get into the brain of young Haymitch. Okay, moving right along, let's go to the 2-star reviews. 2 stars from Liz, misery porn. I personally didn't feel like it was misery porn, although this book was very dark, as are, I would say, all of the Hunger Games books. There was a lot of misery in the book, but I didn't feel like any of it was gratuitous. I feel like the events in the book were all there to drive the story forward or to reveal something about the world or about the characters. The next 2-star review is one from Kate. And okay, it's not too long. I feel like this book was a bit disappointing. I felt the main character was not given a lot of depth and didn't have much room to grow. It's tough with a prequel because we already know what happens to him, but I was hoping Collins might try and surprise or subvert the reader's expectations. But I liked this book less than Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, where at least Snow's character and narrative voice felt distinct and recognizable. In the games, I don't feel Haymitch had many opportunities to actually fight or prove himself worthy of winning. It seemed like he was lucky and a lot of people died around him, but he survived more by luck than intelligence. With so many tribute characters, the opponent characters kind of got lost in the narrative, and Haymitch's actions to try and protect people didn't have much of an impact. The section of the story set during the games all feels a bit fruitless and frustrated. I felt the ending was very easy to predict from early on, and the stakes are messy because Haymitch doesn't feel much drive to win the games or actually survive, even though his driving character trait is his relationship with his love interest. Even though he's positioned as this romantic character, we never really see him consider that winning might mean he can be reunited with his love, which I found stretched my disbelief that he would be so unselfish as to not even evaluate the possibilities. This brought up an interesting thought for me because it's true that in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, I did find myself more immersed in President Snow's character, even though I know he turns out to be a despicable person. I don't know why it was so hard for me with Haymitch. He just felt like a completely different person. So there was something about this book that made me feel a little bit disconnected, but I didn't feel the same way with the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I think I'll need to reread that one because there are 2 reviews now that preferred the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, so I don't know if it's just recency bias for me, why I like this book better. I'm really glad this reviewer talked about wanting to be surprised as well, because there was a lot of repetition in this book, more so than the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Snow's character wasn't actually in a reaping and in a games himself. He's a child of the capital, so he wasn't subjected to a reaping and to being a tribute. So that in and of itself was a different perspective that maybe made the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes feel a bit different from the main trilogy. But this book felt very much like a repeat of the trilogy in a lot of ways. So more surprises would have helped with that, I think. There were a lot of tributes because this was the quarter quell, and the special twist on this quarter quell was double the number of tributes. So there were 48 instead of 24, but the book really only focuses on a handful of them, maybe like a dozen of them at the most. So it was handy to read this on ebook because I could just search the name in the book rather than having to flip back. But yeah, it was kind of hard to keep track of the characters at times, but I thought the characters that were highlighted had really nice story arcs, and Suzanne Collins wrote them quite well. Let's read one more review, assuming it's short. Okay, this is a really short one from Stephanie. We didn't need this, and the overuse of songs and poetry throughout the book, particularly towards the end, was obnoxious. I can see why people would be put off by that. I also found it very hard to read the chunks in italics, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, but I didn't think it was obnoxious. I thought it was really interesting, and I know there are things that probably went over my head, or I'm sure there are things that went over my head, but I liked that there was that additional layer. And even though I don't love to read the song lyrics in italics, I will say that when these books are adapted for movies, the songs actually are quite nice. I love The Hanging Tree. It's just so haunting, and it really becomes an earworm. So I think when these songs are adapted for film, the effect will be quite nice. I'm very, very eager to watch this film, even though I don't love any of the films as much as I do the books. It's just so interesting to see the adaptation. All right, a few more reviews. We are going to read some 1-star reviews before ending this video. Here's one by Amico. Very hard to finish. This book, the pacing was, I thought, quite good. It personally wasn't hard for me to finish. I still wanted to read it, even though it wasn't a page turner, but I can see why someone would find it hard to finish. The next review is not too long. It looks like it cuts off though, but let's give it a read. This is from Leo. More like a fan fiction, overly dramatic and missing the mark on portraying the cruel character of the Capitol. With the renaissance of interest in the Hunger Games, it was only a question of time until Suzanne Collins decided to further capitalize on the story. With the first installment of the prequel series, she made a thoughtful decision to portray the Capitol's point of view by telling the story of young Coriolanus Snow and the humble beginnings of the... And I think it cuts off there because there's no see more. Oh, I want to read the rest of this review, but there's quite a bit here already, even though it's short and truncated. I don't know if this is like fan fiction. I didn't find it overly dramatic, although some of the I love you like all fire, just the frequency of that exchange was a bit too much for me, but I didn't think it was overly dramatic. And I also think that it portrayed the cruel character of the Capitol quite well. There were a lot of twisted things that happened in this book, and I think President Snow's very, very twisted nature, how much he had devolved since the 10th Hunger Games, I think it really came through. And also, if Suzanne Collins wanted to capitalize on the popularity of the Hunger Games, it wouldn't have taken her 5 years to release another book. That's quite a long time in terms of release dates. There are a lot of authors that release book after book after book every single year or every other year. So I don't think this book was written just to capitalize on the success of the Hunger Games. This book did seem pretty well thought out, even though it does follow a similar formula to the original Hunger Games book. That is going to be it for my review of Sunrise on the Reaping. Thank you all so much for watching this review. If you've read Sunrise on the Reaping, please let me know down below what you thought of it. I'll be back very soon with another video. Until then, please take care and bye for now.